Okay, so we are ready to start Lecture 5. This is called Founding a Nation, and it's really about how the U.S. is going to set up a government now. No longer, obviously, under British rules, or no longer wanting to be under British rules, so have to come up with a new way of doing things. One thing to keep in mind is that the first form of government that the U.S. set up, we're not independent from Britain when they start trying to create this. And the fact that we're not yet independent feeds into a lot of the decisions that were made about how to set this government up. The first form of government that we have isn't actually the Constitution, it's the Articles of Confederation. They were written by Congress in 77, and they were ratified, 81, I think. So the revolution's not over. And a lot of what the Articles of Confederation focus on is what they don't want. The people who wrote this, they're not thinking necessarily in the kind of government that will last for the future. They're not thinking about what they do want, what they think would be good. They're thinking about all of the things that Britain did wrong and trying to set up a government that can't do those things. So it's extremely restrictive toward what any kind of national level government can do. And that's due to another thing to keep in mind, is that at this point, the leaders of the United States, specifically the leaders of the individual states, don't really think of the U.S. as a nation. Today we talk about one nation, it's this unified thing, we have a national identity. That really didn't exist during the Articles of Confederation period. It starts to build, but it's certainly not there at the beginning. And a lot of people think of Virginia as their nation, or New York as their nation. And so the Articles of Confederation don't establish a government the way that we would understand it. It's really more of a mutual defense treaty. And the Articles described themselves as a firm league of friendship among the sovereign states. So under the Articles, each of the 13 states kept a great deal of independence, much more than they have today. The national government is extraordinarily weak. There's only one house in the National Congress, and every state had only one vote. And the Congress was not based on population, so a little tiny state like New Hampshire got one vote, and Virginia, which was the biggest state with the most people, got one vote. That's going to be one of the problems that people have with the Articles of Confederation. There is no president. There is no executive branch whatsoever. And so the Articles of Confederation don't really create a mechanism for enforcement of laws. And you needed 9 states, 9 of the 13 states, to pass any kind of law. And then there's that sort of lack of enforcement power. Because what the men who are writing this are thinking is about everything that they didn't like under Britain. They didn't like the power of the king. They didn't like one person having that power, so they don't establish a position where one person can have that power. There's no national judicial system, there's no Supreme Court, there's no federal courts, there's no federal system at all. And if you wanted to change, if you wanted to amend the Articles of Confederation, all of the states would have to agree to that. The only powers that the Articles specifically gave to the National Congress were the powers needed to complete the war. So Congress can declare war. They can handle foreign affairs and alliances. They can make treaties, but not a lot besides that. Congress has no real financial power under the Articles of Confederation. It could coin money, it could print money, but it couldn't tax at all. And it couldn't even regulate trade. Because remember, that's one of the things that Britain had done that really annoyed the colonists. So they're like, no regulation of trade. Congress could ask each state to give them money, but there's no guarantee that the states would send anything or how much they would send. So under the Articles of Confederation, it's really not possible to have a powerful national government. But even with all of the restrictions that they faced, the Confederation Congress did actually manage to accomplish some things. Probably the most important was getting control over the land to the west of the Appalachian Mountains, and making rules for how that land would be settled. The fights over this land, the squabbles between the states over this land were huge. And it's actually the debates over that land that almost stopped the Articles from getting ratified in the first place. The original charters for the early colonies, like Virginia, were made when England didn't know how big the continent was. So, colony of Virginia, now the state of Virginia, its original charter said that it was bounded on the west by the ocean, which, if you now take that at face value, now in the late 1700s, when they do know how big the continent is, that sounds like Virginia can claim, straight west of them all the way out to the Pacific. Other states do not want Virginia to be able to do that. They resent Virginia trying to snatch up a bunch more land. They said that land to the west, Indian land, ought to belong to the nation as a whole. So it wasn't easy to come up with rules for what to do with this territory and how to settle white settlers on that territory. This territory that the U.S. has gotten out of the war stretches from the old colonial boundaries to the Mississippi River. White Americans tended to talk about this land as if it were empty, but in fact, a solid 100,000 people already lived there. Now, Congress, like we talked about in the last lecture, Congress claimed that those people, like all 100,000 of them, had forfeited their right to the land by siding with the British during the war. Now, of course, we know that some had actually fought for the Patriots, and some, especially those in the far west, had been entirely neutral. But U.S. representatives demanded and got large surrenders of Indian land north of the Ohio River. They followed that with similar treaties with the Choctaw and the Chickasaw and the Cherokee. Although with those nations, Congress did sign treaties that said those nations could stay on pieces of their land permanently, as long as the grass shall grow, according to the treaty. Of course, we only have to look around our own neighborhoods today in Oklahoma to see that that's not going to be honored. Now, when it came time to dispense the land north of the Ohio River and figure out how to allow white people in there to settle it, the Confederation Congress has even more conflicting pressures. Many of the congressmen believe that family farms, small farmers, ought to have access to that land in the West. But Congress also knows that they need money fast. We have an immense debt left over from the war. Of course, while the war is still going on, we can't pay our bills. And you can get money fast by selling this land to land companies, to wealthy plantation owners, to big land speculators, rather than letting small farmers have it. Now, another bonus to that was that wealthy men, the speculation companies, the land companies, they can afford to hire private militias to go out and defend their land. So that way, Congress won't even have to spend money on soldiers to protect the settlers. Which is a good thing, because at the end of the Revolution, when the vast majority of the army and the militias go home, the United States has fewer than 200 permanent soldiers left. Now, in a way, the settlers kind of forced Congress's hand in this issue. As soon as the Revolution was officially over, and actually in some places before, they started streaming into the frontier, across the Appalachians. To those settlers, this land was the spoils of war, and it was a part of their freedom. They didn't care about native people living there, and they asked the government to either sell the land to settlers cheaply or maybe just give it away. On the other hand, there were some folks who were afraid that if U.S. settlers just went streaming over the Appalachians, it would provoke more warfare with the Indians, and it would also create communities where there's not a lot of law and order. They tended to view these frontier settlers as disorderly and not very respectful of authority. Ben Franklin called these settlers our debtors, our loose women, and our slaves. The new Confederation Congress felt like it would be better to make sure that there were strict rules for settlement and to get law and order in place in these new territories before too many settlers arrived. So throughout the 1780s, Congress approved a series of laws to define how Western land could be sold and settled. And collectively, these are called the Northwest Ordinances. The Ordinance of 1784 set up the stages of self-government for the West. That ordinance, 1784, said that the Northwest region, which is the area in green here on the map, said that the Northwest region would be divided into districts, and the districts will be governed by Congress. But as settlers move into those districts, as the population there grows, they will be able to take these steps toward becoming states. The next year, 1785, Congress passed another Northwest Ordinance. This one was a surveying ordinance. This said that the government will go out and survey the land and then sell the land in sections, which is a mile square. So if you've driven country roads, if you've lived in this part of the country very long, you drive the country roads, the gravel roads, and they intersect at miles, right? They're each a mile apart. Those are the section lines, the old section lines that had been surveyed since the 1700s. The government was willing to sell each section for $1 per acre, but you had to buy the entire section. That's kind of a problem. The Congress passed these ordinances to try to make sure that settlement was neat and orderly. They wanted settlers to move close to each other because the army or the company's militias could protect them better that way if they were all spread out. But the settlers were, as some people suspected, a little disorderly, and many of them spread into the West before the surveys were even complete. And part of the problem was the size of the plot for sale. At this point, the minimum purchase was an entire section, 1 square mile, which is 640 acres. Now, the government is willing to sell it for $1 an acre, but you have to buy the entire section. That's $640. All at once. They won't give you a loan for it. They won't let you pay it off. You have to pony up $640. And that's out of the reach of most small farm families. So what ended up happening was Congress sold most of these sections to land speculators, to wealthy men, to groups of wealthy men who could afford to buy up, 100 sections at a time, entire townships. And then those companies will sell to small farmers. They'll sell off half sections, quarter sections, quarter sections. That's just 40 acres. They would jack up the price too. So instead of paying $1 per acre for the government, you're paying $2 to $5 an acre to these land speculation companies. But you can buy it in smaller units. You as an individual farmer probably can't manage $640 to buy an entire section. But you might be able to afford $80, $120 to buy that 40 acres. Yeah, you're getting screwed. But you can scrape together enough to afford that. Now, the settlers, though, find this unfair. They find it troublesome, and they complain that this land policy that is supposed to benefit settlers is actually benefiting corporations. But Congress, they kind of feel like it's not possible to do it another way, and they also don't want to do it another way. They feel like it's inefficient for the federal government to handle tiny little parcels of land. It's inefficient for the government to sell off a quarter acre, a quarter section. They thought it was better, really, to outsource that subdivision to private land companies. And for decades, settlers will complain about the difficulty of getting government land at the low government price. And that problem won't really be addressed until the Homestead Act that takes effect in 1863. Now, the last of the Northwest ordinances was passed in 1787. That ordinance called for 3 to 5 states to be established in the Northwest Territories. And looking at the map, you can see that they eventually settled on the 5. The Northwest Territories are north of the Ohio River, east of the Mississippi. Congress did not want the U.S. to become an empire. They did not want the United States to establish colonies in the West and rule over them. They wanted the frontier to become equal partners as states. And so Congress said, as the settlers expand, self-government should go with them. Now, this last ordinance also said that the United States would deal with the local Indian nations in utmost good faith, and that their land would never be taken without their consent. But federal doesn't apply, national land policy assumed that eventually, probably sooner rather than later, the Indians would disappear. Now, that last ordinance also outlawed slavery in the Old Northwest, which will have some far-reaching consequences as the years go by. So the Confederation Congress did have an achievement, or a series of achievements all related to this land settlement issue. However, the Confederation failed in some important respects, failed so badly that eventually they just decided to chuck the whole thing and start over. One of the biggest problems was money. The new United States was in a tremendous amount of debt. To pay for the war, Congress had sold government bonds and then paid its soldiers and a lot of its suppliers in basically IOUs. So now Congress has spent the money, but they can't pay off that debt. And remember, under the Confederation, they don't have the power to tax. They also don't have the power to regulate trade. And we're having trouble finding trade. Before the Revolution, our biggest trading partner had been Britain and other British colonies. But now they don't really want to buy our stuff for some reason. We do have trading relations with France and Spain. But what's actually happening there is they're not buying our stuff. They're flooding our markets with cheap foreign imports. And that hurt American craftsmen, and it drove down wages, and it drained money out of the country, and Congress can't really do anything about that. So the individual states try to fix the problems, but they usually only try to fix it for their own state, not the whole country. They're not thinking nationally. Some states put tariffs on imports from other countries, and then put tariffs on imports from other states. Farmers are spiraling into debt. They're on the verge of losing their land, so they demand some kind of relief. So do craftsmen who owe money to local merchants, but can't make enough money to pay it off because of all the tariffs and the foreign imports and the blah, blah, blah. Some states started printing their own money, like the state of Massachusetts has its own money. And the currency that they use, let me make this bigger for you guys. The currency that they set up is weird and not standardized at all. So Massachusetts, they're using dollars. Down here, they're using shillings, and they're in odd, like, currency units. So we've got an $8 bill here, and New Hampshire's got a $7 note. And there's nothing really to back this currency up. Like, we're supposed to be on the gold standard. Most Western countries are saying that they're on the gold standard, but no state actually has enough gold to back up the currency that they're printing. And with nothing backing it, people lose confidence in the money, and the money loses value. And another problem was that one state doesn't necessarily have to accept currency from another state. So if you are a merchant in New York City and you want to bring in Virginia tobacco and Carolina rice and Georgia indigo to sell to your customers in New York, you can't buy that with New York currency. You have to somehow get your hands on Virginia and Carolina and Georgia currency in order to buy those things. Now, some states just tried to stop debt collection entirely until the economy, like, miraculously improved. That was not necessarily popular. And eventually this all turned extremely violent. In late 1786, early 87, a farmer named Daniel Shays, who was a Revolutionary War veteran, he led a group of Massachusetts farmers to just shut down the courts in Massachusetts. Massachusetts at this point was not really doing anything to help debtors or farmers or fix their economy. They're just kind of paralyzed. The courts were issuing foreclosure notices and sending out the sheriffs to try and seize people's farms. And Daniel Shays and his men figured that if the courts are shut down, then they can't issue those foreclosures anymore. Thinking there. So they just tried to shut down the entire court system. The governor sent the state army after them, and more than 1,000 men were arrested. The governor of Massachusetts was afraid that this is going to cause anarchy and another war. Thomas Jefferson heard about it while he was off being a diplomat in Paris, and he was kind of amused by it. He said a little rebellion now and then is a good thing. But, he wasn't there with a gun pointed at him. For a lot of leaders, political leaders and men who want to be political leaders, Shays' rebellion was just the final straw. By this point, there's a group of influential men who have decided that this disconnection between the states is harmful. They believed that the national government needed to be strong in order to develop national policies to fix what are really national problems. Some of those men also believed that maybe liberty has gone too far. Maybe all of these restraints on the government are encouraging people to behave in ways that we would prefer they not. James Madison, a young man from Virginia, wrote that the people's liberty can be endangered by the abuse of liberty as well as by the abuse of power. He believed that unchecked power in the hands of the people could be a threat to private property and private rights. Now, Madison's from Virginia. He's a young man, a lifelong kind of disciple of Thomas Jefferson, and he's one of the men calling for a stronger national government. Well, another one was Alexander Hamilton. He was actually from the West Indies. He had immigrated to North America to go to college and then served under Washington during the war. Now, Hamilton in particular wanted what he called an energetic government. Hamilton had a vision. He had this vision of the United States as a world power. And he had that vision probably before anybody else did. The point that the country is at now, 1786, 87, there's actually no guarantee that the United States will survive at all. And there are many people who are afraid that it won't. And there are also many people who say that it shouldn't. That maybe this experiment this friendship league among the states ought to be dissolved, and each state should go its own way. So when Hamilton's saying, no, the U.S. can hang together, and also the U.S. can be a world power, that sounded a little bit banana crackers to an awful lot of people. But he's got this vision of what the U.S. can be. And men like Hamilton and Madison are nation builders. They believe that Americans are squandering the fruits of independence, and that national authority was the only thing that could get us back on track. Their concerns and their beliefs were also shared by men who had started to develop kind of a national outlook during the war and during their service to the Confederation. John Marshall served in the Continental Army during the war. He will later become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He said that while he served in the Army, he had first come to think of America as his country, not Virginia. And now that it's, a decade since he first joined the Army, he's starting to say publicly that when men think of Virginia as their country, or think of Georgia or Massachusetts as their country, that it hurts the whole of America. Now, other people who supported a stronger national government included, the big economic interests, especially the ones that Congress owed money to. A lot of craftsmen were demanding protection from foreign goods. Merchants want access to more markets, and they all think that a strong national government will give it to them. That's just about all they agreed on, though. After Shays' Rebellion, every state sent delegates to a meeting to fix the Articles of Confederation. That's all they're supposed to do. They're supposed to amend the Articles of Confederation. They want to strengthen the national government a little bit. That's what they're sent to do. But when the delegates arrive at this new convention, they shut the windows, they barred the doors, and they forbid each other to speak or write to anyone of what they're actually doing. Because what they're actually doing is not amending the Articles of Confederation. What they're doing is creating something entirely new. 55 men came to what will become the Constitutional Convention. They included some of the most prominent Americans, like George Washington, George Mason, who wrote the Virginia Declaration of Rights. Ben Franklin was there. He was 81, and they said he mostly slept through the meetings. But the real push for this, though, was led by young men. Now, none of these guys are really representative of the people. They're all men of education, status, wealth. Hamilton had been born into near poverty, but by this point, he's a pretty well-off dude, too. At a time when fewer than 1/10 of 1% of American men went to college, more than half of these delegates had. A majority of them had been part of the conventions and the meetings in the run-up to the Revolution. Most of them were Revolutionary War veterans. So their shared status and their shared experiences gave them a shared belief in the need for national authority. Their discussions took place very much in private, though. James Madison took careful notes. He was the only one who was allowed to write down what was happening. But he kept them very safely private, and they were not published until after he died. They wanted to make sure that if this went wrong, there would be no evidence to connect them to this thing that the people don't want. So when Madison wrote down the notes and kept the records, he kept them very safe and private. And in his will, he said that they must not be published until the last of the delegates have died. So nobody left alive could be injured by anything that's said in there. And as it turned out, he was the last of the delegates to die. They all agreed that the new government should have a legislature, but should also have an executive and a national court system. They agree that the legislature, the Congress, should have the power to raise money without going begging to the states. They agreed that states should not be allowed to infringe on the rights of property owners. And they mostly agreed that the government should be a republic, that there should be no lifelong inherited power, and the government ought to represent the people. There were a handful of delegates who disagreed on the republic part. Hamilton wanted Washington to become the king. And when Washington refused, Hamilton asked him to be the president for life. And then Washington refused that too. Hamilton also thought that the Senate should serve for life. He thought that the rich and the well-born must rule, he said, for the masses seldom judge right. Which is kind of ironic because Hamilton wasn't well-born himself, but I guess he forgot that. Now, most of the delegates are not here for monarchy. They're also not here for total anarchy. George Mason said that the Articles of Confederation had been too democratic. We don't want to do that again. But he also said that we have to be careful not to go too far the other way. Most of the delegates believe that the key to a stable, effective government is finding a way to balance the people's liberty with the government's power. But they ran into some difficulty in agreeing on exactly the balance there, and also the balance between big states and small states, the balance between the national government and the state governments. So we're gonna talk about this battle between the big and small states first. Under the Articles of Confederation, we had that one house Congress, and every state just got one vote. Big states didn't like that. So at the Constitutional Convention, James Madison presents what he calls the Virginia Plan of Congress. The Virginia Plan would have a two-house legislature, but both of them will be based on population. That's obviously going to benefit Virginia because they are the state with the most people. But smaller states are offended by this. They don't want to be dominated by the big ones. So they rally behind the New Jersey Plan of Congress, which calls for keeping Congress exactly the way it was under the Confederation. A single-house Congress, a unicameral Congress, where every state has one vote. In the end, they compromised. It's called the Connecticut Compromise, or sometimes the Great Compromise. Both of those phrases are correct. The Great Compromise created a two-house legislature, but one part is based on population, and the other part has the same number of votes for every state. So the House of Representatives is the house in Congress that's based on population. The Senate has 2 members from every state. Now, originally, the people didn't get to elect senators. The senators were chosen by the state legislatures, and they serve, and still serve, for 6 years. That was deliberately to keep them a little bit removed from public opinion. On the other hand, the House of Representatives, which were directly elected by the people, were elected every 2 years. That keeps them maybe a little more connected to public opinion. Now, the House of Representatives was supposed to be an expansion of democracy. James Madison believed that letting the people elect a small segment of the government was necessary for them to feel free. But in many ways, this new government is not very democratic. For one thing, even though the federal government cannot have property qualifications for voting or religious qualifications for voting, it doesn't say that states can't do that. And the states absolutely will do that. And the delegates also wanted to shield the national government from too much democratic control. They wanted really only the right kind of men to hold office. I mean, yes, the people get a choice sort of in some areas, but they ought to choose between members of the elite. Now, the Senate was supposed to only have the most distinguished citizens of a state, The House of Representatives at first was very small because the men who wrote the Constitution assumed that only very prominent men could win elections. And the Constitution didn't and does not still allow us to directly elect either federal judges or the president. Members of the Supreme Court are chosen by the president and they are appointed for life. The president is chosen either by the Electoral College, which is what usually happens, or by the House of Representatives. When you go in and you vote for president, you don't actually cast your vote for that person. You cast your vote for that party's Electoral College. That's still how it works. You go to the ballot box, you think you're casting a vote for the dude running for president, you're actually voting for an elector. And when the Constitution was written, the delegates, the men who wrote it, assumed that all of the electors would be prominent, wealthy, well-educated, and better qualified to choose the head of state than ordinary voters would be. Now, the actual system of electing presidents was, as we still know, very confusing. The way it originally worked was each member of the Electoral College was supposed to cast 2 votes for president, first choice, second choice. And the guy who gets the most votes, the number 1 number of votes, gets to be president. The guy who comes in second was supposed to be vice president. Candidates didn't run on tickets back then the way they do today. But if no candidate gets a majority, if no candidate gets more than 50% of the vote, then the House of Representatives was supposed to pick the president from the top 3 vote getters, and then the Senate would choose the vice president. And I know this is incredibly confusing, and you're probably sitting there going, what is going on here? They wanted it to be confusing. The men who wrote the Constitution expected that what would happen is, in a majority of elections, no one would get a majority. No one would get more than half of the popular vote. So they figured that in most elections, the House of Representatives would get to pick who the president is. And ultimately, it would not really be in the hands of the people at all. They wrote this extremely cumbersome system of indirect elections precisely because they didn't trust ordinary voters to know what they were doing. Today, it's still pretty confusing. It's less confusing than the original way of electing presidents, but it's still pretty confusing. The Constitution's only about 4,000 words long, and they hammered it out in 3.5, 4 months. It was not supposed to deal with every single eventuality. It was supposed to be just an outline for a new government. But in those 4,000 words, really very short document, it embodied 2 basic political principles that we still live with today. One of those principles is federalism. Federalism is the division of power between states and the national government. And the other principle is checks and balances between the different branches of the national government. We also call that separation of powers. Division of powers is the balance between the feds and the states. Separation of powers is the balance between the legislature, the executive, and the judicial branches. Now, federalism is that relationship between the national government and the states. And compared to the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution really strengthened national power. It gave the president the power to enforce law and command the military. It gave Congress the power to levy taxes and borrow money and now regulate trade and declare war, deal with foreign nations, and promote the general welfare. And the Constitution says that federal law is the supreme law of the land. States under the new Constitution are no longer allowed to issue paper money, interfere with contracts, or levy their own tariffs and import and export duties and control their own trade. On the other hand, most day-to-day stuff Most of just the regular things that the government does that affect you, most of that's still in state hands. Education, mostly in state hands. Law enforcement, unless you cross state lines, that is a state issue. Clean water, that's your transportation, your road construction, that's all state stuff. This is a recipe for a major debate, though, a debate that still continues. Where does the line fall between federal and state power? And over the decades, we have drawn that line in different places. For the first 50 years or so, states continued to have much more power in practice than the federal government did. And the federal government really didn't try to regulate states as much as it could have. But when there's a war, the federal government becomes much more powerful and never quite shrinks back to where it was before the war. Now we've got the checks and balances, the separation of powers. In that way, no one branch of government can control everything. So Congress passes laws, but if the president doesn't like that law, he can veto it. But there again, we don't want one man to have absolute power. So if Congress feels really strongly that this law is good, they can get a 2/3 majority and override his veto. And then if the people decide, man, that law sucks, we can challenge it to the Supreme Court, to the judicial branch, and the judicial branch can strike that law down. Those judges, they're nominated by the president, but the Senate must approve them. Now the president, if he does something really terrible, or terrible in Congress's eyes, he can be impeached by the House and tried by the Senate and removed from office. That can happen to Supreme Court judges too. So all of these branches have to work together to get anything done. But one of the biggest debates during the Constitutional Convention, though, wasn't necessarily over how the government would function. It was over the issue of slavery. Many of the delegates were slave owners, including Madison and Washington. Madison said that he hated slavery, even though he owned slaves, and he benefited from it. The whole time he was at the convention, he talked about how terrible slavery was. But then when he went home to Virginia and he was trying to convince Virginia to ratify the Constitution, he told them, don't worry, it's okay. I made sure it protected slavery for you. Now, the words slave and slavery don't actually appear in the Constitution. One delegate from Maryland, a big slave-owning state, said that they wanted to avoid using words that might be offensive. In other words, we don't want to hurt the delicate feelings of slave owners, but we do want to protect the institution of slavery. The Constitution said that Congress was not allowed to abolish the slave trade for the first 20 years of its existence. The Constitution required even states that had abolished slavery to send fugitive slaves, runaways, back to their owners. And it contained the 3/5 compromise. The 3/5 compromise said that 3/5, 60%, of the slave population will be counted toward a state's representation in Congress and its electoral votes. So what this means is states that have a lot of slaves are going to get extra seats in Congress based on these people who are not allowed to vote. States with a lot of slaves are going to get extra electoral votes for president based on the existence of these people who aren't allowed to choose the president. The 3/5 clause greatly enhanced the power of the southern states. Of the first 16 presidential elections, all but 4 put a southern slave owner in the White House. Let's illustrate exactly how this works. We'll compare South Carolina with New Hampshire. South Carolina and New Hampshire have roughly the same free population. South Carolina's got about 70,000 free people. New Hampshire's got about 71,000 free people. New Hampshire does have some slaves. They've got fewer than 1,000. South Carolina has some slaves. They've got 75,000. So when it comes time to figure out how many seats in Congress South Carolina and New Hampshire have, South Carolina gets 2 extra seats based on 3/5 of their slave population. That's 2 extra votes in the House of Representatives and 2 extra electoral votes for president. Now, South Carolina's slaves are not allowed to vote. They don't get to have any kind of voice in the government that rules over them. But South Carolina gets to count them towards their white citizens' ability to have power in the government. The Fugitive Slave Clause created this idea that the condition of bondage is attached to a person even if that person has gotten to a state where slavery was abolished. Now, frankly, if you're concerned about states' rights, that is a massive violation of the rights of northern states. They are being required to recognize and help police the institution of slavery, even if it's illegal in their own territory. Even the fact that the original Constitution didn't have a Bill of Rights was because of slavery. A South Carolina delegate complained that bills of rights always start by saying that all men are born free, and he didn't want that. Now, the Constitution said that it would take effect once 9 of the states had ratified it. But that's not a sure thing. There was actually a really fierce public battle to try and get the states to ratify it. Those who opposed the Constitution, those who did not want the Constitution, were called the Anti-Federalists. They don't like the idea of a federal government. They say that the Constitution is shifting the balance of power too far away from the liberty of the people. Some of these anti-federalists are state politicians who are afraid of losing their influence. Some of them are small farmers whose states gave them like debt relief during the economic crisis. Some of them are angry that the Constitution protects slavery. Some of them are angry that the Constitution doesn't protect slavery enough. And the Anti-Federalists repeatedly said that if the Constitution is ratified, we'll end up with a government that's controlled by men who are so elite that they don't understand ordinary Americans, and they will support laws that are harmful to ordinary Americans. The Anti-Federalists said that the best self-government happens in small communities. They said that one federal government can't rule over such a vast territory with such a diverse population and still protect everyone's freedom. Some of the Anti-Federalists argued that the well-born will dominate everyone else, and instead of having one king, it'll be like having a bunch of little kings. The Anti-Federalists talk a lot about liberty. They said that liberty was the power to govern yourself, and they're afraid that the Constitution won't let you do that. They said that the Constitution can't protect the people's liberty because it didn't have a Bill of Rights. Now, most of the state constitutions had bills of rights, but if the federal Constitution takes effect, the states will have to surrender most of their power to the feds, with no guarantee that the feds will respect basic liberties. In the end, those who supported the Constitution were only able to get it done, only able to get the Constitution ratified by promising the Anti-Federalists that the first thing they would do is pass a Bill of Rights. So the Bill of Rights is the legacy of the Anti-Federalists. These are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Madison wrote them. He didn't want to. He believed that the Constitution, the way it was, would protect the people's rights, because he said that the government should only do what the Constitution explicitly says they can, and the Constitution doesn't explicitly say that they can violate the people's rights. Yeah. Madison also said that just because you have a Bill of Rights doesn't actually mean you're safe. He says if your liberty is so shaky that you've only got what's written down, then you're in trouble. He said it was just a parchment barrier to abuse of power. And I mean, he was kind of right, but whatever, he had to do it, so he did it. Now, the specific language of the Bill of Rights is rooted in classical liberalism and in the Enlightenment. Let's look at what it says here. This is the First Amendment. It says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Does the First Amendment say Congress gives you freedom of speech? Congress gives you freedom of religion? That's often the assumption that people make, but that's not actually what the words say. And that's because this is a classical, liberal, Enlightenment document. Rights are inherent in humanity. Rights cannot be given to you by the government, and rights cannot be taken away by the government. Now, a bad government might infringe on your rights. A bad government might fail to uphold your rights, but it cannot take away your rights because it cannot make you not human. And Madison straight up said when he wrote this, when he finished the Bill of Rights, that this is not a complete list of your rights. The Ninth Amendment specifically says that rights not mentioned still belong to the people. Now, some of the parts of the Bill of Rights are very old ideas, like the Eighth Amendment, the one that says no cruel and unusual punishment. That goes back to the 1300s in England. But other provisions were very modern. The most remarkable of those was the recognition of religious freedom. Unlike most other governmental documents at this time, unlike the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution is purely secular. There is no reference to any God at all in the Constitution, and it specifically bars religious tests for office holders at the federal level. The First Amendment forbids Congress from establishing a religion, which is a complete departure from British law and from colonial law. Actually, that's one of the criticisms that some people had of the Bill of Rights. One guy complained that a Mohammedan, a deist, or even an atheist could become the president. And Madison said, well, yeah, that's the point. And the Constitution opens with the words, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. We ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America. I only know that from Schoolhouse Rock. If you want to remember it, it probably wouldn't hurt you to look at the Schoolhouse Rock videos. They're still pretty entertaining. Now, you might assume that when the Constitution says we the people, it means every person living within the borders of the United States, but that assumption is not correct. The Constitution identifies three specific populations: Indians, other persons, which means slaves, and the people. And only those who counted as the people were entitled to American freedom. Every nation has to define its identity, has to figure out what it means to be a part of this nation. And there are a couple of different ways that you can do it. There's ethnic nationalism. Ethnic nationalism is based on a shared ethnic heritage and language and culture and often religion. And then there is civic nationalism. Civic nationalism is open to anyone who is devoted to the political institutions and the values of the nation. Now, the U.S. today is recognized as mostly having civic nationalism, where this mix of cultures and languages and religions Now, immigrants who become citizens swear an oath, but they don't swear an oath to be Protestant or speak English. They swear this oath: to uphold the Constitution and the law and defend it when asked. Now, there's a lot of hoops that you have to jump through to get to the point where you swear this oath, but to be a citizen, you just swear to uphold the Constitution and the law. And native-born citizens don't even have to swear to that. It's just like kind of assumed that we will do that. Now, from the beginning, the framers of the Constitution wanted to believe that they were creating a nation with civic nationalism, but they failed in that respect. If we look more closely at the reality of who enjoyed rights and citizenship, we can see that in the beginning, American nationality really only attached to people of certain races. Now, the policies toward slaves and Native people illustrate that. U.S. leaders believed that the West should not be left in Indian hands, but they disagreed about what should happen to Indian people. The government wanted to encourage white settlement in the West, which meant that they would either have to move the Indians further west or just disappear them altogether, or incorporate them into white understandings of civilization and someday allow them to become citizens. But most white Americans believed that the nations weren't fit for citizenship. And so Indian nations had no representation to the U.S. government, no ambassadors, no diplomats. The treaty system gave them a unique, lesser status within the United States. The treaties usually said, these early treaties at least, usually said that they recognized Indian sovereignty over their land. But in practice, the treaties were used to transfer land from Indian nations to the federal government or to the states. Often a treaty would be agreed to only by a tiny percentage of a tribe, but then the entire tribe would have to abide by it. That's what happened to the Cherokee in the Treaty of New Echota, which we haven't gotten to yet. We'll talk about that in detail in a later lecture. Now, when Washington was president, the U.S. said that they wanted to deal with the nations with a minimum of violence and with honor. The Secretary of War at this point was the guy who was in charge of Indian affairs. The first Secretary of War was Henry Knox, and he said that the way Britain had treated Indian tribes had been dishonorable and destructive. He said that the U.S. must do better. He encouraged Congress to forbid taking Indian land without a peaceful treaty. But several states went ahead and tried to do it anyway, and there was a war. In 1791, Michiganaqua, the white people called him Little Turtle, he was the leader of a Miami Confederation. He joined together with Blue Jacket of the Shawnee and about 16 other tribes. They defeated U.S. troops in the Ohio Valley. It was the costliest loss ever suffered by the U.S. Army at the hands of an Indian army. It was actually worse in terms of percentage of the army that died. It was worse than Custer's last stand at Little Bighorn. Now, this confederation included Wyandot, Delaware, Shawnee, some Cherokee, a whole lot of folks that we know around here. The U.S. retaliated. They sent the bulk of the U.S. Army that existed at the time. They sent into the Ohio Valley to try and defeat Little Turtle and Blue Jacket and their alliance, and failed again. Little Turtle's war continued until 1794, until finally the U.S. defeated Little Turtle, really defeated Blue Jacket at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794. In the treaty that ended this war, the Allied nations ceded most of their land in Ohio and Indiana to the federal government. This treaty, it's the Treaty of Greenville, also created the annuity system, which still kind of exists today. It's been heavily modified, but The annuity system originally was annual payments from the government to the tribes as long as those tribes agreed to let the U.S. government move them where the U.S. wanted them to be and let the U.S. government have some control over how they lived. So that gave outsiders a considerable amount of power over Indian life. There were some members of the government who criticized that. Thomas Jefferson was the Secretary of State at this point, and he argued that Native people should not be treated as if they were inferior. Now, he was a little bit condescending about it, though. He said that Indians lived at a less advanced stage of civilization, but that they were inherently, if they would just live like white people, they could be civilized like white people. He said that Indians should abandon their traditional ways, should get rid of communal land ownership, traditional hunting, and instead they ought to practice European-style, small-scale, private landowning farming. He told a group of Cherokee leaders that once you possess property, you may join us in our government, which is ridiculous because the Cherokee already possessed private property. But whatever. Jefferson, and to an extent Washington, believed that Indian nations could become assimilated into the United States. And so Washington asked Congress to give him the money to buy like agricultural tools and livestock to give to Indian men, and by spinning wheels and looms and female craft stuff to give to Indian women. They believed that having European gender norms was a step on the road to being truly civilized. But most Indian nations don't want this. They want to keep their autonomy. They want their sovereignty. They want their way of life. There just doesn't seem to be any room for that in the American empire. By 1790, the number of African Americans far exceeded the number of Native Americans within U.S. territory. But the status of free black people was a little bit iffy. The original Constitution doesn't say who is a citizen. We don't get a constitutional definition of what it means to be a citizen until the 14th Amendment after the Civil War. So who is a citizen was left up to individual states to decide. Most of the northern states assumed that freed slaves would remain there, that they would stay in Massachusetts, stay in New York, and be citizens there. Northern political leaders like Ben Franklin and Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, who was the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, they all worked for abolition. They all helped to build schools for black children. And during this revolutionary era, the period between 76 and about 1800, free black people in most states had some protected rights, including the right to vote in most states. But the large majority of African Americans were slaves, and slavery made them basically invisible in the idea of an American community. The language of liberty did not apply to them. Most white Americans didn't really think of black people, free or slave, in their concept of America. The Constitution allows Congress to create a system for immigrants to become citizens. That's called the naturalization process. And the first naturalization law that Congress passed in 1790 created the first kind of legal definition of becoming an American citizen. And in that law, naturalization was restricted only to free white persons. For 80 years, no non-white immigrant could become a naturalized citizen. African immigrants were allowed to do so in 1870. And understand, slaves don't even count as immigrants. Immigrants are voluntary arrivals. African immigrants weren't allowed to become naturalized citizens until 1870. Asian immigrants couldn't be citizens until the 1940s. John Locke, we've talked about him, kind of the father of Western classical liberalism. He's, the basis of a lot of Enlightenment philosophy. He wrote that man's liberty came from man having reason, having the ability to think rationally. So if politicians could argue that a group of people were not capable of rational thought, then it became okay to exclude those people from liberty. And white Americans increasingly viewed African Americans as permanently deficient in self-control and reason and understanding and all of those things that make a citizen. Jefferson wrote that African people had a natural intellectual disability. But he also said that their experience as slaves had taken the opportunity to develop better away from them. He said that slaves, as long as they were kept as slaves, would not be capable of developing into citizens. And he said because of that, they cannot be set free. Slaves should not be freed because since they were slaves, they're not capable of being citizens. If they were free, they might be able to develop into being citizens, but there's some circular logic going on there, right? Jefferson was kind of obsessed with the connection between nature and nurture. Are people born the way they will be, or does their environment shape them? And Jefferson wasn't always consistent in how he thought about nature versus nurture. For example, he believed that Native people were naturally equal in intelligence to white people, but that their environment, their nurture, was holding them back. And he did recognize that being held in slavery, the environment, the nurture, I guess, held black people back. But he couldn't quite bring himself to believe that they could ever naturally be equal. Benjamin Banneker was a free black man from Maryland who had taught himself mathematics and astronomy and meteorology and all sorts of things. He wrote an almanac. And almanacs back in the day were not like farmers' almanacs today. People actually used them, and not just for like recipes and cute stories. The old almanacs would tell you when the last frost is likely to be, so don't plant before that. It'll tell you what they expect the temperature to be, what they expect the rainfall to be, so you can actually use that information. And if almanacs were written by people who take their work seriously, like Benjamin Banneker, they could be really excellent tools for farmers to use. So Banneker took this almanac that he had written, and he sent it to Jefferson, along with this letter that you read for Readings Quiz 2, and a plea for the abolition of slavery. He sent the almanac as proof that black men can be just as intelligent as white men. And Jefferson did write back to him. Jefferson said, "Nobody wishes more than I do to see proof that nature has given to our black brethren talents equal to the other colors of men." But then Jefferson wrote another letter to a white friend of his and said he was pretty sure that a white person must have done the calculations for Banneker's almanac. Jefferson talked civic nationalism, but he walked ethnic nationalism. In his practice, he showed that he really believed that the U.S. ought to be homogenous, with common experiences and common inborn abilities. I'm using air quotes here. He believed that black Americans might, in some situations, be able to exercise natural rights, but not in the United States. He believed that if people were freed, they should be sent back to Africa, to the Caribbean, have their own separate nations. Jefferson is okay imagining Native people and white people creating a nation, but he just can't imagine including black people in that. But there are some prominent men who disagree with Jefferson. Edward Coles was a Virginia slave owner. He was a contemporary of Jefferson and actually didn't live very far away from Jefferson. But he moved to Illinois Territory, and he freed all of his slaves, and he helped them settle on their own farms. And then he began to speak out against slavery. In George Washington's will, he said that all of his slaves, 277 of them, ought to be freed after the death of his wife, Martha. And Martha Washington actually freed them voluntarily about a year after George died, not entirely out of humane considerations, more because it's very nerve-wracking to be surrounded by almost 300 people who are waiting for you to die. Even Jefferson said that he wanted to be humane. He believed that it was a sin to sell a child away from their mother, so he would not do that unless he, really needed the money. During his lifetime, he only freed 2 slaves. Both of them were brothers of another slave named Sally Hemings. In Jefferson's will, he freed only 5 slaves, all of them relatives of Sally Hemings. You may have heard her name. If you haven't, she was not just his slave, she was his mistress. She bore to him multiple children. The first time she got pregnant, she was 14 years old. She was also his wife's half-sister. Jefferson did allow 2 of the children that he had with Sally Hemings to run away. One of them he apparently gave $50 to and put her on the train to Washington, D.C., and then said, "Oops, I guess she ran away." But he died in so much debt that his daughter absolutely destroyed the community that his slaves had built. She sold off the majority of them in all different directions. Hey, even while the decline of indentured servitude and unpaid apprenticeships narrow the levels of freedom for white people, the revolution ends up widening the division between free Americans and enslaved Americans. And by this point, race has firmly become a justification for inequality. Not everybody believed in that justification, though. I mean, it's easy for us to sit here and say, well, it was a different time, nobody knew it was wrong. People absolutely knew it was wrong. Alexander Hamilton knew it was wrong. He said that African Americans' natural faculties are as good as white men's. But he also said that slavery makes us imagine many things that are not founded in reason. He said that to defend slavery, to keep slavery in existence, white people were willing to believe untrue things about black people. And we, the people, increasingly only meant white Americans. So we'll talk about how this government works in practice when we get to the next lecture.